Welcome to another virtual panel discussion of the Centre for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge. Thank you for joining today's session on protecting the Uyghurs, responsibility to protect in China. Variously described as the world's most technologically sophisticated genocide and potentially the worst crime we've seen since the Holocaust, oppression of the Uyghur minority by the Chinese state poses a grave challenge to international society. Evidence of mass incarceration, systematic abuse of detainees, forced labour, pervasive surveillance, which includes the collection of DNA, the tracking of all vehicles, and the imposition of over 1.1 million Han Chinese government employees to monitor families and individuals in their homes and places of worship, not to mention a well-documented program of forced sterilisation and abortions, and the removal of Uyghur children from their parents. All of this suggests that the People's Republic of China is committing crimes against humanity as defined in the Rome Statutes and stands in violation of at least 4 articles of the Genocide Convention. The situation in Xinjiang might be the severest test yet faced by the responsibility to protect. How can international society compel China to reverse its policies? Indeed, can it, especially given how China is a permanent member of the Security Council? And would failure to do so signal the start of a dystopian new era of international politics, reversing some of the uneven progress made since 1945? Does R2P have a place in these efforts? And what does Pillar 3 require of other powerful actors in this case? These are some of the questions we are addressing today. I'm Thomas Peake, Research Associate at the Centre for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge, and I'm joined today by Eva Pills, Professor of Law at King's College London, Adrian Zenz, Senior Fellow in China Studies at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, and Nadira Court, Programme Manager at the Global Centre for Responsibility to Protect. We were also scheduled to have been joined by Rushan Abbas of the Campaign for Uyghurs, but unfortunately she has had to withdraw from the panel. And welcome also to our truly global audience. I encourage you to submit questions to our panel through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Just click it open, type your question, and it will magically reach our panelists. Please do note whether or not your question is directed to a specific panelist or to the panel in general. And please do record any university or other institutional affiliation should you have one. Now, before we get to our always thought-provoking audience questions, I will invite each of our speakers to say a few words, beginning with Eva Pills. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you for organizing the event on this really important issue. My background is as a legal scholar who has worked on human rights and human rights defenders in China for a number of years. And so in my work with human rights defenders in particular, I was very often in conversations about forced disappearance and torture, often affecting my interlocutors directly themselves, but also the people they were working with and for, including members of persecuted communities of faith in China, such as, for example, Falun Gong. And very often these were narratives of the police coming and grabbing someone, placing a black hood over their head, taking them to an unknown location and holding them there using a number of methods of torture, stress positions, beatings, also, especially in recent years, forced medication, typically with the purpose of extracting a forced confession, a false confession of wrongdoing, and especially in the case of members of the spiritual group Falun Gong, also through a process referred to as education and transformation, 教育转化, also for the purpose of extracting a kind of profession of renunciation of their faith. And it was never in the history of the People's Republic of China, which describes itself as a people's democratic dictatorship, really possible to get much accountability for human rights violations, even of this very serious kind. But perhaps during the sort of some 30 years following the death of Mao Zedong, there was at least some hope of achieving accountability, at least in the sense of recognition and support from a growing civil society, including the very human rights defenders I was speaking to. Now, under Xi Jinping, that situation started dramatically worsening. So Xi Jinping became president of China in 2013. And we have seen, on the one hand, power concentration, and on the other, successive waves of crackdowns on civil society, affecting the media, affecting the legal profession, academia, NGOs, and so on and so forth. And that tightening of the system, that deepening of authoritarianism in China is the background, I think, for the developments in the Xinjiang Uighur Autonomous Region, where even to begin with, of course, we had marginalized groups, including these predominantly Muslim, Turkic-speaking ethno-religious minorities, the Uyghurs, the Kazakhs, and various other minorities. And especially since the appointment of a new party secretary, Chen Quanguo, there has been a very rapid deterioration. Now, I think that we will hear in a moment from our fellow panelist, Adrian, more about the worst aspect of these developments, the camps. Camps that my Chinese human rights defender friends, so far as they dare discuss these issues, refer to as 集中营 concentration camps. Camps holding, or camps with a capacity, I should perhaps say, of over 1 million estimated, that have been constructed since 2017. And that, as we also heard from Thomas earlier on, are meant to hold persons deemed at risk of religious extremism. And that include practices that in many ways remind me of those conversations I had with direct victims, except that the incarceration, the torture, including forced medication, and various other practices of torture happen at a scale, a scope that is very, very hard to really take on board. We will hear more, I think, from Adrian about the evidence for the existence of these camps, so I will not comment on that now. I will say, though, that importantly, the Chinese government has admitted the existence of these facilities, but insists that they are for the purpose of voluntary training. And beyond the camps, the internment camps, I think it is also important to remember, as Thomas mentioned briefly in his introduction, that there are many repressive practices affecting the sort of Xinjiang minority communities as a whole. One of them, at least, the use of extensive surveillance methods, both offline and online, again, somewhat reminds me of methods of repression, monitoring, and control that are used more widely in China. But then there are, of course, also the forced sterilisations, the removal of children from families, the destruction of cultural and religious sites, And all these are sort of against the backdrop of a civil society crackdown that, so far as Xinjiang is concerned, so far as I know, has really silenced the attempts to record and advocate against these crimes. Now, very briefly, since I am a legal academic, on the legal assessment of these practices, so far as we understand them, I would only say that on the face of what we know, these practices violate domestic law in China, that violate domestic criminal law, not least because the government has not tried to provide a legal justification for detaining people, at least so far as the training camps are concerned. It insists that people are held voluntarily. They are, of course, also, these practices, of course, also constitute systematic violations of numerous human rights, the right to life, to liberty and integrity of the person, the right not to be tortured, freedom of expression, freedom of religion or belief, anti-discrimination rights, etc., etc. They constitute forced labor, also in the context of transnational supply chains, an aspect, a point that is important for any, for our later discussion, I hope, of potential advocacy efforts. And then, of course, there is, as Thomas mentioned earlier on, the fact that on the basis of what we know, these practices constitute apparent crimes against humanity, including, but not limited to, imprisonment, to enforced disappearance and torture and sexual violence as part of systematic widespread attacks against a civilian population. Then there are the allegations of genocide, as is defined, for example, in Article 6 of the Rome Statute and the Genocide Convention, as well as by sort of use cogens of international law. On those, I would say that while we have deeply concerning evidence, as Thomas mentioned, of different kinds of acts of potentially genocidal acts, there is a problem at this point, as the law stands, with evidencing genocidal intent as defined by international treaty law, the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial or religious group. But I should also say that there very often is a problem of evidencing genocidal intent, and that one of the complaints about the international law on genocide is that it is so stringent that the tools of international criminal law never become available until the genocide is already over. Perhaps we should remember what Philippe Sands, Professor Sands, said earlier this year in a publication, reminding us that we must not, I quote here, fetishize the names we give to acts of horror. The treatment of the Uyghurs or the Yazidis or the Rohingya or myriad other groups and individuals is wrong and criminal, whatever it is called. For the sake of Uyghurs who need our active and urgent support, we should focus, he says, on the substance, not the label. I would like to conclude by just very briefly mentioning the attempts that the international community has made, the responses that we can observe so far to these apparent crimes against humanity from the international community. So there have been various UN Special Rapporteur, UN Special Mechanisms reports, and there has been an expert call by UN-based experts calling essentially for the establishment of a special mechanism, such as a special rapporteur or a panel of experts or special envoy regarding systematic human rights violations in China and especially Xinjiang. There have been numerous joint statements by UN member states, most recently only last month. And individual countries, such as, for instance, the United States, have used sanctions known as Magnitsky sanctions that are imposed against individuals implicated in the perpetration of these horrors. And then there have been also transnational advocacy efforts, for instance, in the context of supply chains using forced labor. And then lastly, of course, there have been calls to use international criminal law, including a call on the ICC to investigate an alleged crime of genocide. Needless to say, while there have been these efforts, nothing so far has even remotely appeared to work to stop the ongoing crimes against humanity in China. So I will conclude here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for such an insightful opening, and now delighted to hear from Adrian Zendt.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I will elaborate on these very enlightening and helpful remarks of our first presenter, specifically by focusing more on the latest findings on demographic genocide and sterilization. So, as has been presented, since 2017, an estimated up to 1.8 million Uyghurs and other minorities in Xinjiang have been swept up by what has been referred to as the possibly largest incarceration of an ethno-religious minority since the Holocaust. This campaign has been variously described as a cultural genocide. Mounting evidence on that has included internment, especially of men, a systematic campaign of separating children from parents through securitized boarding schools and orphanages, and different forms of coercive labor, which also aids in the breaking up of family units and inhibits the intergenerational transmission of religion, culture, and language. Based on government documents, it's evident that Beijing's long-term stability maintenance strategy in the region is based on a perverse and extremely intrusive combination of forced, or at least involuntary training and labor, intergenerational separation, and social control over family units. In 2016, Xinjiang laid the foundation for this campaign of oppression by recruiting tens of thousands of new security forces and setting up an advanced system of technological surveillance and of intrusive social control, whereby hundreds of thousands of government officials eat, live, and sleep with local minority families. Now, new research published in the summer this year gives strong evidence that Beijing's actions in Xinjiang also meet at least one of the physical genocide criteria cited in Section D of Article 2 of the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, quote, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the targeted group. Starting in 2018, a growing number of female internment camp survivors have testified that they were given injections that coincided with changes in or cessation of their menstrual cycles. Others reported that they were forcibly fitted with intrauterine contraceptive devices, IUDs, prior to internment, or were subjected to coercive sterilization surgery. Also in 2018, we can observe that official natural population growth rates in Xinjiang have plummeted. In Kashgar and Khotan, two Uyghur heartland regions, the combined natural population growth rate fell by 84% between 2015 and 2018. In 2019, birth rates in ethnic minority regions declined by a further between 30 and 56%, depending on the county. For 2020, one minority prefecture set a birth rate target of near zero, 1.05 per mil, per thousand, that is. New evidence shows that drastic declines in population growth are not merely linked with the campaign of mass internment, as one might expect or speculate, but that there's also a systematic state policy to prevent births, primarily in minority regions. With many men, husbands, and community leaders being detained in camps, nothing prevents the state from seizing complete control over female minority reproductive systems. First, 3 different government documents show that those who violate birth prevention policies are punished with internment. Second, in 2018, a stunning 80% of all newly placed IUDs in China were fitted in Xinjiang. That's net added IUDs, new placements minus removals, even though the region only makes up 1.8% of the country's population. By 2019, Xinjiang planned to subject over 80% of women of childbearing age in the southern minority prefectures to, quote, birth control measures with long-term effectiveness, unquote. This refers to either IUDs or sterilisations in the Xinjiang minority context. Third, Xinjiang's Health Commission budgeted 260 million Chinese yuan in 2019 and 2020 to fund free birth prevention surgeries. Family planning documents from 2 Uyghur counties show specific target figures for mass female sterilization, stating respectively that 14% and 34% of all rural women of reproductive age are to be subjected to tubal ligation sterilization. The entire region-wide program had sufficient funding in 2019 and 20 for hundreds of thousands of sterilizations, and some regions indicated that additional central government funds had been channeled into the campaign. In addition, in 2019-2020, Xinjiang budgeted about 1.5 billion Chinese yuan. That would be about $250 million US. You can convert it to pounds accordingly. I'm not up to date with the latest exchange rate, for financial rewards for women who supposedly voluntarily opted for birth prevention methods, including IUDs or sterilizations, even though they're legally permitted to have a 3rd child. In my estimation, all of these measures combined allow the Chinese state to permanently maintain Uyghur natural population growth rates at levels that are 85 to 95% below those of the past 2 decades. The government can dial minority birth rates up and down at will, like opening or closing a faucet. This new evidence is reflective not only of what we may call demographic genocide, but also apparently of a strategy of ethno-racial supremacy. Between 2015 and 18, an estimated 2 million Han Chinese migrants moved to Xinjiang from other parts of China, lured by lucrative government job offers, free housing and free land. So it's a systematic government initiative, advertising it and offering very generous financial incentives. These findings raise serious concerns as to whether Beijing's policies in Xinjiang represent, in fundamental respects, what might be characterized as a demographic campaign of genocide per the text of Section D, Article 2 of the UN Convention that I cited at the beginning. I've chosen a term, demographic genocide, that is not well established, is not a legal term, sort of on purpose, simply because I'm not a legal scholar. And a legal appraisal of genocide is an entirely different matter. It's a matter of conforming to a fairly narrowly defined set and legal framework that was established many years ago, which may or may not be adequate to capture genocide. It certainly does not include cultural genocide or ethnocide, even though there was a proposal back then to include it. It was excluded at the request of several countries, probably including the Soviet Union. I'm not an expert on that, but there's a whole kind of debate surrounding the whole thing. Genocide is a very loaded word. Again, I think China, sometimes I like to say China is performing kind of like a Holocaust 2.0. That might be a strong wording, but I use it, I kind of throw out the term to just make clear that there's something 2.0, something new going on, something sophisticated that comes very close to destroying an ethnic group in a certain way. I personally do not believe that China is trying to exterminate the Uyghurs. That's not the ideology behind it. So the comparison to the Holocaust absolutely stops at the point of physical killing of huge numbers or very large shares of persons. Of course, you do have higher mortality in internment camps. You do have the prevention of life through birth prevention. At the same time, that is a very, very important distinction to be made. At the same time, I think one can notice how the Uyghurs and many others are struggling to capture to what is going on here, and they're hanging on. People are hanging on to the word genocide because the word genocide emotionally expresses the near unprecedented scale of the and nature of this atrocity, and sort of the unprecedented, we can use the word unprecedented, the unprecedented sophistication of this ethnocide, etc. that is happening, that world has not quite seen at the level of resource mobilization, billions of dollars into this police state, at the level of technological sophistications, a social control mechanism, etc. in the 21st century. And with these sort of vague elaborations, I'd like to conclude my statements.
Thank you very much, Adrian. And just a quick point before we move to Nadira. Of course, the issue of technical definitions of genocide is a very live one. And we always have to remember that Darfur didn't look like Rwanda, and Rwanda didn't look like the Holocaust. And so, yeah, on that note, and before we turn to questions from the audience, please, Nadira Court.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you to the Center for Geopolitics for organizing this event and inviting me to speak. And thank you to the fellow panelists for their remarks that I will try to build on. My organization works on UN advocacy primarily, and in New York and Geneva. I want to begin by addressing the question you posed in the introduction on what happens when crimes against humanity and a possible genocide are perpetrated by a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and what does it mean for the responsibility to protect. I would argue that even though it's rare that crimes are perpetrated by a permanent member, it's not unprecedented. And a permanent member can also block virtually any situation they wish to, regardless whether it's occurring in their territory or not. So I think the question that we should be asking here is what the international community in the UN can and should do in the absence of UN Security Council action. So when we talk about RTP, I think there is a lot that can be done outside of Security Council. When it comes to China, of course, it holds an enormous amount of influence at the UN. It's hard to deny that. It will continue to manipulate the system to reinforce its narrative that is carrying out legitimate counterterrorism activities and that the matter is purely of domestic nature. It will continue to deny access to the country and the region for independent observers, including relevant special rapporteurs, the High Commission of Human Rights, and other actors. And well, China technically extended an invitation to the High Commissioner, but realistically, it was just for show because it refuses to provide adequate access for the High Commissioner and her team to go to Xinjiang. At the same time, it's interesting to note that China actually invited the Undersecretary General of the UN Counterterrorism Office to visit Xinjiang. And in fact, that official has been the only high-level UN official that was able to visit the region. And this was a clear attempt by the Chinese authorities to reinforce this narrative and manipulate the UN to say that it's battling a terrorist threat in the region. China also continues to relentlessly lobby governments to ensure that they do not sign on to any statements of condemnation, the ones that Eva spoke about in her remarks, or worse, to actively support counter statements that China efforts in Xinjiang are actually positive. So this year, for example, 45 countries signed on to joint statements expressing support for China's counterterrorism and de-radicalization measures in Xinjiang. And those, if you're looking at who signed on to that statement, there are some perpetrators of atrocities. So we have violators like Myanmar, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and others. There are also some African, Asian, and notably Muslim majority countries that continue to side with China, and primarily, but not exclusively, because of economic considerations. But as evidence of atrocities continues to mount, the cost of supporting China also increases, and the condemnation within the UN and around the world also grows. And you can see that in the number of countries that continue to release those statements. As Eva mentioned as well, there was an unprecedented call by 50 special procedures in the summer. So really a call for the Human Rights Council to hold a special session and to create a mechanism that would monitor and analyze the situation. There was also a statement at the Human Rights Council in Geneva by 27 countries that the UK spearheaded. And just last month here in New York at the General Assembly, Germany delivered a statement on behalf of 39 countries that expressed concern about the treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. So it's actually quite a big increase from the previous year when it was only 23 countries. So we have an increase of 16 countries that joined this statement of condemnation, which I think is significant. You also can look at who those countries were, and it's a much more regionally diverse group as well, not just Western countries, but includes Eastern Europe, Latin America, Asia, and the Pacific. Of course, it's not, it's still only 39 countries, but still it's quite an improvement considering the weight that China holds at the UN and beyond. So while action is not possible within the Security Council itself, as these numbers rise, it's important that other UN actors really respond in any way possible. So even though China was recently elected to the Human Rights Council for the period of 2021-2022, it cannot really block any action within that body, where unlike the Security Council, they don't have a veto power. So in order to hold a special session, as was suggested by the 50 special rapporteurs, any member of the Human Rights Council can call for that session, and they need approval of only 1/3 of the membership of the council. And given the numbers I mentioned earlier, it's such scenario is quite possible. Also, these two UN bodies, Human Rights Council and the General Assembly, also really need to translate these increasing numbers into votes eventually. That's the hope, and they can create a mechanism that would monitor the situation and report on it. And those similar mechanisms that were created for other countries were really have proven to be instrumental in shedding light on the situations, providing analysis as to whether international crimes have occurred, genocide or crimes against humanity, supplying actionable points for all relevant actors, and ultimately advancing accountability efforts. And even if the mechanism will not get access to China, which I assume it won't, there are precedents in countries such as Myanmar, Venezuela, DPRK, where those mechanisms also didn't get access, but they still very effectively perform their functions, including through interviews with survivors who were able to flee those countries. When it comes to accountability efforts, of course, options are quite limited, but because the Security Council can't really refer the situation to the International Criminal Court, and China is not a party to the Rome Statute. But as was mentioned earlier as well, there are already some initiatives. Just a few days ago, the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, a group of legislators from 16 countries, sent a letter to the ICC prosecutor extending support for an earlier complaint that was submitted by a group of London-based lawyers who were representing two Uyghur groups in claiming that ICC should look into the crimes perpetrated in ICC state parties of Cambodia and Tajikistan, who arrest and deport Uyghurs to China at their request. Other avenues that should be explored is the principle of universal jurisdiction, under which perpetrators of grave international crimes could be prosecuted domestically, irrespective of the citizenship of perpetrators. So it's not an easy route, and I think none of those are, but I think that it's time also for international actors to get creative, what they can do when at a time when the Security Council is blocked. So just to conclude, RTP can really be upheld in various ways. And of course, the bilateral measures, the measures that can be taken by regional organizations, including sanctions making sure that businesses are not sourcing products from Xinjiang, and other measures that we can discuss. So I'll end here.
Thank you very much, Nadira, and thank you all. And just a reminder to the audience, please do send your questions in through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And please do also list your name and your university or other affiliation, should you have one. So I wonder if first of all, it might be worth shelving the technical legal genocide question, and asking, I suppose, to Nadira first of all, perhaps through an R2P lens, what could be the most effective and timely interventions that states and that civil society actors can make?
I think just to build on what I said, it's a constant also war of narratives, right? So it's important for everybody to continue reinforcing the narrative that what's happening in China is not simply a domestic issue, but that crimes against humanity and a possible genocide are really concerned to the whole world. So statements of support, it's important for states to speak out, make statements. It's important to create either for the Secretary General to appoint a special envoy to create a mechanism that we have on record of what the crimes are, to maybe create a mechanism that could prepare files for future persecution, even though it's not going to be right away, but still some future accountability measures that can be utilized for. Bilateral measures, we know countries like the United States has imposed various sanctions on Chinese officials and on businesses as well. So I think others could follow suit. There's also some efforts to boycott the Olympics or others that were driven by regular people, not necessarily governments, but all advocacy avenues are really valid, I think, and need to be pursued.
Very interesting. And Eva, perhaps you would like to weigh in on this one, on the effectiveness, the potential effectiveness of these interventions.
Well, thank you so much. I think that accountability indeed is a really important sort of word here. I think that in addition perhaps to preparing the ground by recording crimes and recording evidence of crimes with a view to further sort of investigation, prosecution at some point in the however distant future, I think that it is important to keep in mind that creating a record can have a deterrent effect, or at least an obstruction, sort of an obstruction effect, if you like, in the present, because especially if officials immediately involved in the sort of commission and the perpetration of these crimes are made aware of the fact that they might face accountability at some point. In that context, I think it might be useful to mention just once more the use of the so-called Magnitsky Act sanctions or Magnitsky sanctions. From a human rights perspective, not wholly unproblematic, but nevertheless a tool for governments to impose travel bans, to impose asset freezes and the like on those deemed to be, on those certified to be involved in perpetration of these very, very grave crimes. I think that again, that can contribute to at least deterring some of the worst practices. And I think additionally, I would perhaps mention, although I think it has been sort of mentioned briefly before, the various advocacy efforts by transnational NGOs and so on that are really aimed at targeting sort of complicity, our complicity with practices in Xinjiang for instance, as a result of trade relations, of supply chains that involve the export of various goods thought to be made with forced labor into the UK, other countries in Europe, the United States, and so on. What can you do there? Well, you can point you can approach companies involved in these supply chains, remind them of their human rights responsibilities. You can also, as for instance, the Global Legal Action Network has done in the UK, try to approach approach government and point out its responsibilities in the context of customs authorities, for example, for not admitting the import of goods made with forced labor. So I think that there are tools that at least target these practices, even though I fully agree with Nadira's assessment that it is especially difficult in the case of China to influence its practices simply because of its vast power in the world.
Adrian, what are your views on this? I think you're muted, Adrian, sorry.
Yes. Well, part of me always has some hopes about rescuing some of the multilateral institutions, be it through just a very aggressive pointing out of elite capture by China, and just highlighting the extent to which China captures elites at these the United Nations, etc., in order to push through its human rights agenda, prevent the criticism of its own human rights. We have to remember that China actually had an anti-discrimination review in 2018, which was also the context where it first admitted the existence of these camps, and it passed with nearly flying colors, at the end of in December 2018. And I think it's very dangerous to just accept that as a status quo, even though it is the status quo. I think these are things that need to be named. So I think the naming and shaming has a lot more potential than what we have seen, notably from top tiers of governments, Western governments, or any government that cares about human rights. At the same time, I do agree there's initiatives, legal initiatives such as the ICC in The Hague, trying to use different mechanisms that others are more qualified to comment on than myself. But beyond that, I do believe that the issue of forced labor is possibly one of the most promising. Enacting an economic cost would also really speak to the Chinese Communist Party. That's very much its own language in terms of economic power. Using economic power to expand its influence is one of its primary strategies, actually, as we can see, including economic coercion. And so I think that the issue of forced labor is one to very heavily seized upon in this particular context.
Thank you. And turning to our first question from the audience, which is addressed to all of the panel, but I think Nadira might be the most appropriate to turn to first. It comes from Rosemary Foote at the University of Oxford, who asks, am I right in thinking that the language of R2P hasn't been much used in this case? And if so, what does this tell us about the status of the norm of R2P? And are these difficulties with regard to accountability part of a more general weakening in global provisions to protect individuals from mass atrocities?
I think when it comes to China, the language of the responsibility to protect is not, of course, it's not used within the Security Council, but I think it is used in other fora. But as I said, it's not just the Security Council that we have to look at. We have to look at the whole array of measures that we can take to uphold our R2P, right? When we talk about responsibility to protect, there is also prevention, there is supporting governments, etc. There is accountability, there is sanctions, arms embargoes. So I think we have to look at the whole array of measures that we can take. And sometimes we use R2P language and sometimes we don't. I guess the issue is to focus on the issue at hand, which is protecting the Uyghur community, other vulnerable populations within. But when we're talking about the Security Council, I mean, unfortunately, it's a political institution, right? And we have five permanent members who do as they please, who have a veto power. So of course it's an ongoing struggle really to apply norms, not only RTP, but other norms. We know that human rights architecture in general and multilateralism these days is under attack by many governments, populist and otherwise. So I think it's time that we really use all available avenues to uphold the norms, uphold the human rights treaties, genocide conventions, other norms through other available avenues. When it comes to, for example, the situation of Myanmar, genocide convention really came into play, and Myanmar was taken to the court by a state party who is not really physically connected to that. Or when we look at other countries, they use other available avenues. So I think when it comes to China, one has to be really creative and use the RTP architecture, use human rights architectures in Geneva and wider.
Thank you. And Eva, did you want to comment on the specificities of R2P as a discourse in this case?
Well, thank you very much. Perhaps only by saying that I think that to some extent R2P has, in sort of international discourse, been given a sort of difficult reputation by some of the ways in which the concept has been used in totally different contexts, of course, to justify what has sometimes been very loosely referred to as humanitarian intervention without actual backing, without actual justification in light of the UN Charter, in light of international law. And I think that that may perhaps in a broader sense have contributed to a kind of wariness about using the concept of R2P. But I must totally agree with Nadira that, of course, what we need to pay attention to is really sort of the substance of the ongoing human rights violations and the obligations that result from these violations for the international community and for all states, certainly, obviously including China. If I might, I would also like to perhaps add an additional dimension of potential advocacy, if I might quickly sort of add that, which is that I think we should talk more about how to reach the mainstream Chinese population on what is going on in Xinjiang. That, of course, is very difficult. There is plenty of disinformation and censorship and repression and fear, I think, surrounding this topic, I think even amongst human rights advocates. But there is also, I think part of the reason why disinformation and censorship and so on are successful is because the government has long cultivated prejudice towards the ethno-religious minorities, especially in Xinjiang. And of course, that kind of ties in with sort of broader narratives of Islamophobia and so on that we are very familiar with over here. And I think that all of that combines to make it very difficult for sort of people, sort of the mainstream population in China fully to understand what is happening in Xinjiang. I do think that if we found ways of better communicating, of more often raising these issues with our Chinese friends, that might be something that the Chinese government would also pay attention to.
Adrian, do you want to weigh in on this one? I think you're muted still, sorry.
Probably not. My familiarity with those frameworks is just not that strong, really. Okay,
so the next question comes to us from Colin Barnes, who is a fellow at the Centre for the Environment, Energy and National Resource Governance at the University of Cambridge. And he asked a question which has been partially touched upon already. To what extent have other Islamic countries, or to what extent have Islamic countries expressed their views regarding the situation of the Uyghur people? And if not, is this largely, as was hinted at before, attributable to economic pressure?
Maybe I can, since I touched upon it in my remarks a little bit, just to build on. I think if you look at it, the difference is quite vast in how I also covered the situation in Myanmar and the treatment of the Rohingya community, which is also a small Muslim minority community. And if you look at how the Muslim world reacted to those two situations, it cannot be more different. Right, so the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which has more than 50 Muslim majority countries, they backed the Gambia to file a case against Myanmar at the International Court of Justice, and they have been uniformly supportive of measures and also just vocal in their statements of support towards their Muslim Rohingya community. When it comes to the Uyghurs, the record is really mixed at best. And if you look at those who signed on to those statements of support, they include countries like Pakistan, for example, or Saudi Arabia, that are Muslim majority governments. And some of them, as I mentioned earlier, are themselves perpetrators of atrocities and human rights violations, and maybe to some extent they don't want to speak out against these issues. Others, I think in my mind, it's primarily economic reasons, right? So the Belt and Road Initiative, vast contracts in Africa and elsewhere in the Middle East, they rely on China on support on so many levels that nobody really dares to speak out. But I think as it's also problematic because a lot of them are complicit in returning Uyghur refugees, forcefully returning them to China. And on that note, I also want to say that one actionable things that all governments can do is to extend support to the Uyghur community in general, especially in granting asylum cases, in practicing non-refoulement principle, and encouraging others to do so, to ensure that they are not being forcefully returned, really opening their doors to this community, because we know that's also another way of holding RTP, right? You can just let this community suffer, but you should try and help them. So I think as the evidence of atrocities in Xinjiang continues to grow, I think the cost for Muslim majority countries in continuing to support China will also rise. And I think in the coming months and years, hopefully more and more countries will transfer from being actively supporting China to at least hopefully neutral, where they will not speak out actively in favor of it. So I think right now that's something we can hope will happen.
Adrian or Eva, would either of you like to touch on this one?
I mean, maybe only by saying, but so far as I understand, there's no shortage of efforts to bring in the OIC countries, but I think that one can just about imagine how many sort of responses, démarches, and so on the Chinese government would deploy to stop these kinds of efforts, and of course the most plausible explanation for why we haven't seen more protests is ultimately the kind of general power, the geopolitical, the economic influence that China has.
Yes, to which I can add that the Belt and Road Initiative is just a very clear indicator of how China leverages economic leverage and coercion, possibility and threat. That's a very important part of this, I believe. At the same time, I think we really need to ask ourselves about the underlying assumption here. I think if you look at the Muslim world, on which I'm not really an expert, but having observed things over the past years, it's quite noticeable that the Muslim world will respond mainly to dogma. So for example, if Muhammad is being slandered, there's huge uproar. But if it comes to human rights of other Muslim groups, I'm not sure that there's actually much of a consistent front there. And notably, the Uyghurs are actually not very much in the mainstream dogma of Islam. It's sort of a very syncretic type of Islam in a far corner of Central Asia, not a core Islamic region. So I think the real interest in the Muslim world in the Uyghurs, in my estimation, is actually very low. And I'm not sure how much of a united front there would be on human rights, unless it was politically expedient. But we also need to understand that a lot of the governments in the Muslim world themselves repress Muslim groups because they might be a threat to their power. So a lot of these governments are authoritarian. And they mainly look at preserving their own power base, to which China, of course, is extremely helpful. And the interest of some remote Islamic group as the Uyghurs is not. So I think that in many ways, it's as simple as that.
Thank you very much. And we've got an enormous number of very interesting and thought-provoking questions, but unfortunately we only have an hour, so we'll have to shelve them. Thank you very much to the audience for posing them. But it's now time to bring to a close this video panel on protecting the Uyghurs, responsibility to protect in China. And I would like to thank all of the audience. And I thank again our panelists, Nadira Court, Eva Peels, and Adrian Zentz. Please do check back shortly on the Centre's website at www.cfg.polis.cam.ac.uk. That's www.cfg.polis.cam.ac.uk, where the video of this discussion will be available to view, usually within 2 to 3 days. And this has been an extremely challenging and interesting discussion to hear from the expertise here. And I only regret that we don't have a more hopeful outlook to offer here, but time will tell. So thank you once again, and very appreciate your time.